welcome to our webinar today with Jenni Donohoo. My name is Charlene Maher, and I am a Senior Marketing Manager at Corwin. And it is my pleasure to introduce Jenni as our thought leader and expert today. Jenni Donohoo has been seconded to the Curriculum and Assessment Policy Branch in the Ontario Ministry of Education for the past few years. In this role, she works with system and school leaders to support high-quality professional learning and improve adolescent literacy. She is a certified visible learning consultant with Corwin and the author of 3 books, including her latest bestseller, Collective Efficacy, also published by Corwin. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jenni Donohoo.
Thank you, Charlene, very much. It's always a pleasure working with you. I'll just begin by saying why I believe that collective efficacy has gained interest in the field of education. And I think it's largely due to the body of visible learning research, the largest synthesis of educational research about what matters most in increasing or raising student achievement. And I'm sure that many of the listeners tonight are very familiar with the visible learning research and the average of all of the influences, what Professor Hattie refers to as the hinge point, that effect size of 0.40, really marking a year's growth for a year's input being our measure in which we need to consider when we're thinking about making changes to our educational practice. And in Professor Hattie's recent update, he has announced that collective efficacy, that belief in what we do, that belief really matters, has an effect size of 1.57. And you can see here on the chart that it's quite significant compared to some of the other factors that influence student achievement. And the good news is it's something that we can influence. It's something that's within our realm of control. And so we're going to spend some time tonight unpacking exactly what that is. Just taking another look at that from the visible learning research, we know that collective teacher efficacy is more than 3 times more powerful and predictive of student achievement than factors like socioeconomic status, home environment, parent involvement, and students' motivation. Through the visible learning research, we also know that collective teacher efficacy is more than 2 times powerful and predictive of student achievement than things like feedback or students' prior achievement. And again, it's something that we can influence in our daily work in our schools to make a difference for kids. So our learning intentions, we've got a lot packed into this next hour together. I'm hoping by the end of this session, we'll be able to understand collective teacher efficacy and its impact on student outcomes. We're going to talk about some of the positive consequences and some of the negative things that happen when collective efficacy is not present. We'll understand how the beliefs are formed and determine, most importantly, how to foster efficacy in our work in schools. The success criteria for tonight, and I'll check in with you again at the end for you to do a self-assessment against this criteria. The questions are, can you identify the characteristics that come with a sense of efficacy amongst team members? Will you be able to explain just briefly the effect size research and identify where different influences rank in relation to collective teacher efficacy? So knowing that collective teacher efficacy is in the #1 position, ranking at the top of factors that influence student achievement. Will you be able to describe some ways that the beliefs really influence the adult actions and behaviors towards students? And name some of the sources. What are different ways and different sources that influence a team's interpretation of their effectiveness? And finally, identifying some leadership practices, 1 or 2 small steps in your work, whether you're a formal or informal leader, but some practical strategies that you can employ to foster collective teacher efficacy in schools. So we'll use this framework, the who, what, when, where, why, and how, and let's begin our examination of collective efficacy by unpacking exactly what it is and where we see it occurring. I want to share just briefly 3 stories that aren't related necessarily to education. But as I share these stories for the audience, I'd like you to listen and try to identify what they have in common. So I'm sure this first image here on the left side of the screen, the U.S. Flight 1549, is familiar to everybody that's joining us this evening. Captain Sully, as he's been known to us, landed that flight in 2009 on the Hudson River. And I listened, and perhaps a lot of you have heard the interview that he did on 2020 with Katie Couric. And I'll just repeat some of the things that he says that stood out to me during that interview. Captain Sully says, when I made the brace for impact announcement, I heard the flight attendants chiming in unison, heads down, stay down. And he said he could hear it coming through the cockpit door, and they were warning and instructing the passengers. And he said he felt a certain comfort in that because he knew that they were all on the same page, that the crew was in it together, and if he could land the plane, he knew that together they would be able to get the passengers out to safety. And at that point, Katie asks him, or makes the statement, but that was a big if. And he replies, I was sure I could do it. He talks later in the interview about relying on his training and that they had never practiced anything quite like that, but through the training and simulations helped to build his confidence. And he also talks about going up and down the aisles a couple of times before exiting the plane himself to make sure that everybody was out. The bridge incident, which you see here, quite a gripping picture there in the center of the PowerPoint. Perhaps some of you are familiar with this story. I interviewed the chief firefighter who was in charge of this rescue recently, and I'll share with you some of the things that he told me about this incident that he came across on a highway in California in 2012. His first assessment of the scene was that there were really three things happening. Rig had run over this BMW, which was being driven by a teacher whose name was Kelly Gross. His name is Kelly Gross. And what you don't see in that picture is there were two bridges, and the semi that ran over the BMW actually plummeted down about 100 feet into that ravine, exploded into flames. Unfortunately, the driver perished, but there was hazardous and explosive materials on fire down below. He said Kelly was in the car. In the back seat, right behind the driver's seat where Kelly's sitting, is her 10-week-old baby, and in the back seat next to her sister is Kelly's 10-year-old daughter. They all made it out of that car with relatively minor injuries. He said when they were called onto the scene that it was a single engine call, and the first thing that Ray said he did was called in for additional resources so that they could use them to their best advantage, that he formed some teams, a cutting team, a stabilizing team, a paramedic team, and that the teams just went to work and relied on their training to get the job done. He also said something that resonated with me when I talked to him. He said that in talking with Kelly, who's sitting in the front seat, she became part of their team, and they were not going to leave any man behind. Direct quote, he said, it was never a focus that we couldn't do this. And one more quick story, and this takes a look into the sports world at the University of Connecticut Huskies. In their early days, they were described as an unremarkable program, but turned into a real powerhouse, having the longest winning streak in the history of college basketball. They're described as having changed the way colleges think about women's athletic programs. And in an interview with one of the team members, she said that instead of focusing on the opponents, Brianna Stewart talked about focusing on playing a perfect game. And she said that's why our standards get higher and higher each time. And the coach has talked about this idea that he really tries to foster a level of respect for the teammates that's really apparent amongst the women on that team. So what do these stories have in common? Each one of them, they're faced with an extremely difficult challenge, but there's a strong conviction amongst the team members that they can really meet with some success despite these other circumstances that they're faced with. There's a strong confidence in the team and a sense that the team members can rely on each other to be capable and dependable, and they're setting the bar high. The expectations for success are high. They're not going to leave anyone behind. And in each case, I think they really rely on their training, and they bring that expertise to the game. And of course, the idea that the expectations for themselves and others are set quite high. I want to just quickly share an example from business as well. Google has studied its organization. It's looked at managers, and more recently, it's spent a couple years looking at what makes the best Google team. They hired a researcher from Harvard to look at their teams, and they had measures in place to look at which teams were the most productive and which teams were the most creative. And then they spent some time trying to figure out what set those teams apart. And what they found was it wasn't so much who made up the team as much as it was around what the team believed. And they had 5 key findings. So in this study, they found that on those high-performing teams, the teams had a sense of psychological safety, that if they felt the team members felt that there was a certain amount of trust built amongst themselves, and that if they tried something that was risky, that it was okay to take those risks. Each team member felt that they understood the goals and their roles were clear. They knew what they needed to do as part of the team. They felt that the work was very much something that was important to them. And these last 2 points, I think, really speak to this notion of collective efficacy, that the team members had confidence in each other's work, and they really believed that what they were doing made a difference. And now another just a quick interesting fact to me, this idea of collective efficacy, the term was that of Albert Bandura's, who's a educational psychologist out of Stanford University. He was the first to notice this idea that a group's confidence in their ability had a relationship with higher achievement. And for me, the interesting fact is it really was first studied in crimes in Chicago. And in the study of criminology, they found that where neighbors had a sense in their community's ability to overcome crime, there was less crime rates in those areas. There was less vandalism, less homicide. And so this relationship exists not only in sports, not only in communities, not only in business, but it's a relationship that also exists in education. And so what does it really look like in education? And I want you to think about some of the schools that you've been in and some of the teams you've worked with. And to me, collective efficacy in schools sounds like teachers coming together and identifying challenges where they're creating and problem-solving solutions to those challenges in order to make a difference for their students. It sounds like teachers leading school improvement initiatives and partnering with students in that process by asking students how they're experiencing school. It's teachers coming together, trying new approaches, monitoring their impact, and adjusting based on feedback and evidence. And it's like the Huskies basketball team or the high-performing Google teams, where teachers and educators have confidence in each other. They share an unwavering belief in their collective capability to change the life courses for their students. A couple examples that are specific to Ontario, and perhaps if you're in a state or province, you'll identify with the idea of standardized tests. In Ontario, we have a literacy test that's administered in grade 10. It's called the Ontario Secondary School Literacy Test. And we looked at schools, our high schools here in Ontario, from 2008 to 2012. And we identified places where teams were having success with students who were in the applied pathway, heading toward college or the workplace. And there's a large gap that exists between students that are in our applied pathway versus students that are in the academic pathway. And we were trying to figure out what is it about these schools that are seeing improved results over time significantly above the provincial average. And we went in and interviewed some of the school teams where they were having huge success with students in applied. And I'll just call them School A and School B. School A and B both shared beliefs that kids could succeed and that the teachers and the adults in the building played a major role in that equation. They had confidence in what they did, and they believed that what they did mattered. They pooled resources to figure it out. They felt it was okay to take risks, and that if they tried something that didn't work, they'd figure out why. And that, what really resonated with me is that they felt like they were change agents. And I'll use that language of the visible learning, the mind frames that Professor Hattie has identified as making a real difference. They knew that what they did mattered. They believed that they were evaluators of their impact on student actions, and they also believed in the power of collaboration. So what did the schools have in common besides that? They, like the stories of the flight on the Hudson River and the bridge incident and the basketball team, they had this sense of collective efficacy. And what that resulted in is the use of effective feedback. I remember talking to teams who were using learning intentions and success criteria with their students and designing some professional learning for their peers for an upcoming day, a system day that they had to do some collaborative learning. They provided varied and multiple opportunities for students to demonstrate their learning. They believed in that idea of mastery learning, that if students didn't get it the first time, they could go back and try again. There was definitely a culture of high expectations. And in the cases in these schools, what resonated with me as well was this idea of a sense of community, and that the schools were really much partnering with parents and open to the community in a way that there was this welcome relationship that existed between the communities and the schools. So I'm just going to pause for a brief second. Again, time for questions at the end. But how does that narrative of School A and School B that was just described, or some of the stories that were shared, compare to the narrative in your own school district or division? And I know through some of my conversations with my friends who are administrators and educators, and some of my relatives, some of my work in the field, that perceptions vary greatly. And some staffs believe that they can have a real difference, and while others, both groups and individuals, feel that there's very little that they can do to impact student results. And so which teams do we really want to foster? Of course, those that believe that what we do really matters, or those that are really characterized that idea of lack of efficacy, that there's nothing left we can try. And so we're going to look at some leadership practices that can really make a difference in influencing a term's interpretation of their effectiveness and their impact. But let's first take a look at who and why efficacy influences. It really impacts students through the adult behaviors. And so I just want to take some time to unpack what are some of the additional beliefs and actions that come as a result of a sense of collective efficacy. And so some of those beliefs and attitudes, and this is all coming through research, and if anyone's interested afterwards in some citations or some reviews of the literature, I can provide that as a follow-up. But we know through research that where collective teacher efficacy is present, teachers also hold high expectations for students. I'm going to hold on to that one too. I'm going to unpack that a little further in a second. But the research also shows that where efficacy is present, groups have more positive attitudes toward inclusion and are more likely to meet the needs of students with special education needs or individual education plans. I think that comes with the confidence that they know they can make a difference. We also know that there's a relationship between collective efficacy and mindset, and that where efficacy is present, there's also an association with educators viewing ability as an acquired skill as opposed to a fixed trait. There are more positive attitudes toward professional learning. Also, other beliefs and attitudes. Oh, that's a repeat, sorry, the mindset connection. And there's also greater job satisfaction and commitment to the teaching profession where there's a sense of collective efficacy. So I would just want to unpack that idea of expectations. And a few years ago, and some of you might remember this study, it's also sometimes referred to as the Rosenthal effect or the Pygmalion effect. But a researcher in the 1960s with the last name of Rosenthal conducted some studies first in some science labs. And he told a group of lab technicians that there were a certain set of rats who were bred to be maize dull, and another group of rats that were bred to be maize brilliant. And at the end of the study, of course, when putting the rats in the mazes, what they found was the group that had been labeled maize brilliant outperformed the maize dull group. And his theory was that the technicians had handled the maize brilliant rats with more care and more frequently. And in the 60s, you could take this study into schools. Of course, we could never do that now with ethics and other reasons. But he went into schools and told teachers that certain groups of students had passed the Harvard test of advanced intelligence, when in fact the test didn't exist, and the students that he had identified were just randomly selected. And of course, the same results came true, that at the end of the year, because teachers expected more from these students, the students produced more. Studies have also been conducted in multiple locations. An interesting one I came across was done in the military, where a group of people who were training, they were identified as command potential and others not so much. Of course, again, random assignment, that at the end of the training course, the group that had been identified or labeled with those higher expectations statistically outperformed their counterparts. And so this idea is this Pygmalion effect, where beliefs about our ability to perform at high levels influence the type of behaviors that we project towards students, which impact students' positive beliefs about their own ability, which cause students to act certain ways and reinforce the teacher's beliefs. And I think this helps to explain this notion of collective efficacy. Also, though, this idea of how efficacy impacts our behaviors, when I think of implementation, and perhaps some of you will have similar experiences, we know through research a lot of what works, but what we need to really do is start focusing our attention on implementing what we know in meaningful ways into our practice. And so implementation seems to be a bit of an issue in education. But there's a number of studies that show that where efficacy is present, teachers are more likely to implement research-based strategies. One that I came across that I found particularly interesting looked at teachers implementing literacy strategies in high schools in content areas. So science and math and phys ed and tech teachers integrating reading and writing strategies in their classrooms. And it showed in schools where efficacy was present, those strategies were more likely to be implemented and adopted with fidelity. And I think they explained that happened because teachers were more likely to persist through those difficult challenges. They were more likely to seek out the resources that they needed and collaborate with each other to solve some of the challenges that are associated with implementing literacy across content areas. And there are other examples of research that show the relationship between collective teacher efficacy and implementation. And so that leads to some of the behaviors and actions that are a consequence of collective teacher efficacy. We know that where efficacy is present, teachers are more likely to encourage family and community involvement. There's a study that looked at efficacy in high schools. And so not only when efficacy is present do teachers feel that they can impact student achievement, but they also have a sense that they can impact positive behavior in students. And therefore, students are less likely to be excluded from schools and from classrooms. Where efficacy is present, there's studies that show there's a relationship between that and teachers' use of intrinsic motivation strategies. They're more likely to intrinsically motivate students as opposed to relying on extrinsic motivation. They set more challenging goals for students. They increase time on task. And where efficacy is present, like the examples of School A and School B that were shared earlier, teachers are more likely to develop mastery experiences for their students. And the biggest consequence to me is where efficacy is present, this idea of raising students' expectations of themselves. Because teachers convince students that they can do well in school. And according to the visible learning research, students' expectations hold the second position in things that matter most in raising student achievement. So how and when does efficacy occur? I've been unpacking. I've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years. When I first heard Professor Hattie make that announcement, I was really curious about the notion of collective efficacy. And there wasn't a lot of practical articles or information that was available. And so in pouring through the research, there's, of course, a relationship that's well established between collective efficacy and student achievement. That body of research is 30, 40 years old. This is not a new notion. There's research that shows the relationship between collective efficacy and teacher efficacy. Again, I can direct people to certain sources. Of course, just unpacking in this last few minutes the relationship between collective efficacy and the productive patterns of behavior on part of the adults in the building. And where we're going to go in the next few minutes is the formation of beliefs. So there's two ways that people form beliefs. It's based on past experiences, environmental factors, and we're going to look at that in the next few minutes. So friend and colleague, actually not a colleague because he's at the Ontario Institute of Studies in Education, but perhaps many of you, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the work of Dr. Stephen Katz. And in having a conversation with him recently, we were talking about this notion of collective efficacy, and he made the suggestion that perhaps I could represent it as a mathematical function because of the number of different ways in which collective efficacy is formed. And so I'm just going to play with this mathematical function and unpack it for you. Collective efficacy, again, I said it's both a function of past experiences, and more recent research shows that it also is influenced from the current context, environmental factors, the here and now. And I want you to think about how you might influence both these past experiences and the present current environmental factors as I unpack the equation. So collective efficacy is a function of mastery experiences, vicarious experiences, social persuasion, and affective states. And these sources come from Albert Bandura as well, and they're both sources for individual and collective efficacy. In the equation, the mastery experiences is capitalized in bold because it's the most influential of all of the sources. And what mastery is when teams have experienced some success, and perhaps they've set a goal, they've met that goal, and they begin to build up their confidence that they can do it again. So they've been faced with a challenge, they've had some success, and it starts to build their belief in their future ability to repeat their effective performances. The second most influential source of past experience comes through vicarious experiences. And that's when a school staff sees others that have similar challenges and opportunities meet with success. Perhaps it's a partnering division in the same school. Perhaps it's a school that's been identified that has similar socioeconomic demographics features as yours. Perhaps you visited the school, perhaps your team has read about it online, but this idea that if somebody else that has been faced with similar challenges has been able to meet with success, we start to build our confidence in our team's ability to do the same. The third source of past experience is social persuasion. And that's when a team is convinced by a credible other that they constitute an effective team. And so I think of this in our use in schools. How can we socially persuade teams to help influence their interpretation of their effectiveness? How can we convince teams that they have what it takes? And the fourth source of past experience are affective states. And they're those feelings of excitement when we've really been able to accomplish something, or the feelings of anxiety when we haven't been able to meet with the success that we had hoped. So besides the past experiences, collective efficacy is also a function of current contextual factors. And I'm going to unpack what these four things are. But in the research, the relationship between joint work and teacher leadership, again, in the equation, they're bold and capitalized because there's more research that shows this relationship. And so joint work, when I think of Judith Warren Little's 1990 article, Judith Warren Little examined PLCs and continues to do so today, and transcribed the dialogue that was occurring in PLCs in both elementary and high schools, and created a taxonomy of collaboration. And at the heart of the taxonomy is what she refers to as joint work. And it's this idea of teachers coming together to deliberate, to identify some problems of practice and solve those problems through their conversations, through trying something in their classrooms, coming back together, discussing to figure out if it worked or not. But their work is very much public and open to scrutiny. There is a clear and strong relationship between teacher leadership in a school and collective efficacy, and that relationship is bidirectional. In schools where teacher leadership is flourishing, so is collective efficacy, and in schools where collective efficacy is strong, there are lots of opportunities for teachers to lead school improvement work in authentic ways. Goal consensus is the third factor when we think about the contextual conditions, and that's when educators have an authentic voice and they're able to help shape what the school goals look like and help measure. So they've got a real stake in the school improvement process. And finally, a sense of belonging. So that impacts us, that idea again about trust and psychological safety or social sensitivity, and this idea of are we part of this team? Do I feel like I belong to this team? And where people do feel that, that's where there is a relationship between sense of belonging and collective efficacy. So again, just taking a look at that mathematical function and thinking about our success criteria for our webinar together, one of the pieces was at the end, could you name some past experiences and some environmental factors that contribute to a sense of efficacy? This is how efficacy beliefs are formed. So it's those idea of mastery experiences, vicarious experiences, social persuasion, and affective states combined with things that are happening in our context, our here and now, teachers coming together to engage in joint work where our contributions depend on each other for success, where leadership opportunities are authentic and varied and plentiful, and where there's a consensus on goals, where people know the goals, know their roles in relation to those goals, and where there is a sense of belonging. So checking in with the success criteria, I'm just going to do a quick pause here before we get to the last chunk, which is the leadership practices. But just do a quick self-assessment. Can you, if you had to describe some of the characteristics that come with a sense of efficacy, what are some of those characteristics? And where does collective efficacy rank in relation to some of the other factors that influence student achievement? what are the consequences of beliefs, both action-wise and how are they related to other beliefs, and what are the sources of past experiences and some of those contextual factors that shape efficacy beliefs. And we're going to spend the last part of our webinar thinking about some of the leadership practices that you can employ to foster collective efficacy in schools. So let's get a little bit deeper in unpacking the how. And when I first presented this section, I was in front of an audience and had half a day with them, and the topic was leadership practices to influence efficacy. And we spent some time really looking at these big ideas. And that night, I went to dinner, and at the restaurant, an administrator who had been in the audience that for the session approached me and introduced himself. And he said to me at the end of the conversation, he said, "Well, I really enjoyed the day, but you didn't tell us how." And I thought about that later in bed that night. I'm laying in bed, you probably like you're going over your day and wondering about, what you might do differently. And I thought, I was kind of wondering about his comment because the topic was how to foster efficacy. And as I thought about it, I realized that for each one of these ideas, if it were looking at creating opportunities for meaningful collaboration, we could ask that question, how do you do that? And if we're thinking about empowering teachers, how do we empower teachers? How do we establish goals? How do we help teams interpret results and provide feedback? And what I'm suggesting is that's our work moving forward. It's going to be different in every situation. It's very adaptive in nature, and the people that are really pursuing the question are the ones that can solve it. And so if we think about this, I think our work together is to figure out how to put these practices in place so that we do see enhanced efficacy, because we know it's so important. But besides all that, there's a little asterisk there. Plus, we've got to consider the role of trust, the past experiences, and changing the narrative. So let's unpack big idea number one, the leadership practices, where we're creating opportunities for meaningful collaboration. And meaningful collaboration is collaboration that's focused on instructional improvement. And I like this study. It's recent, 2015. Roger Goddard and colleagues looked at how leadership rarely has a direct impact on student achievement, but that leaders can have an indirect impact on student achievement through this relationship between setting up structures in schools for teachers to come together to collaborate on issues related to instructional improvement. Where leaders do that, that has an impact, a direct impact on collective efficacy of teachers, and collective efficacy in this study had a direct impact on student achievement. And so we need to ensure that there's dependable, high-trust collaborative structures in place where teachers can come together and learn together, share their expertise, and build common understandings. And what defines meaningful is when teachers' collaborative efforts can help to account for consequences in the classroom. And so what do those structures look like? One example, and there are others, but a lot of the work we work on and support here in Ontario is around a collaborative teacher inquiry cycle. And when we think about collaboration and focused on instructional improvement, to me, this is the essence. We're going to determine what our students need to know and be able to do. We're going to develop a question. We're going to set some goals as a team. We're going to implement some changes in our practice and then come together to see, by examining student learning, did what we do have an impact on students? And then we're going to tweak what we did, because sometimes we might see that it did, and sometimes we might not know the answer to that or think that it didn't. So what is it that we can do to come together through a structure like an inquiry cycle to assess the impact of our actions on student outcomes? And so the second big idea is this idea of empowering teachers by providing authentic opportunities for teachers to engage in school improvement issues where they have a voice and where they have a say, where they're looking at how to improve structures, processes, and ultimately learning for students. one of my favorite quotes from Professional Capital by Andy Hargraves and Michael Fullen is trust the process as well as the people, because when we do turn decision-making power over to educators, that can be a scary place to be. Just sharing a quick story from some of my experiences in the field, working in a high school with a PLC, watching an administrator turn some decision-making power over to a teacher team. I wanted to intervene at one point because where the team was headed was, in my opinion, not necessarily the best place to go, the right path to take. But this particular administrator asked me to just step back, and he monitored the issue. And within a day or two, the team came to realize that where they were going wasn't the right place to go. And so by stepping back, monitoring that process and not intervening, he allowed teachers that autonomy to learn from their mistakes. And I think that's really important. This ladder of involvement in school decision-making shows that at the very bottom, we can involve teachers in degrees of non-participation, which look like manipulation and tokenism, and up working our way to that top rung where teachers are initiating and sharing decision-making power is, I guess, a way of looking at how can we strengthen teachers' involvement. This ladder isn't mine, but the layer of teacher or educator was something I laid upon it. It was actually first initiated by Roger Hart, and it's a ladder of student voice and autonomy in school improvement issues. And so it's just another way of looking at how can we involve teachers and empower them in ways that will make a difference. The third big idea around leadership practices is helping teachers to come to consensus on goals and establish goals in which our expectations are high. I think about some of the issues that I hear teachers experiencing in the field in some of my work in PLCs, and I often hear teachers talk about kids aren't motivated. They have difficulty engaging kids. And I think rarely do we turn then to the research on what we know about motivation. And I'm saying that because I think when we ask teachers and leaders to establish goals, we rarely turn to the research and theory about how goal setting works. And so I think what we need to do in some of our work in the field is to unpack the theory behind setting goals. And Vivian Robinson and her colleagues have done some of that work. And so what can we learn about setting goals from the research that exists? And what I like about this framework, which you'll find in School Leadership and Student Outcomes, it's a synthesis of best evidence, is that there's certain conditions required and that there's processes involved, which include creating a discrepancy between the current reality and our desired future states. And as a result of looking at these conditions and the processes, an increased sense of efficacy is a consequence. The fourth big idea is to help teams interpret results and provide feedback. Again, a link to a teacher inquiry cycle, a collaborative inquiry cycle, where teams are looking at specific evidence to measure growth, not at the end of a report card period or at the end of a year, but evidence in real time to be able to respond to the students that we're serving the current student learning in our classroom. And this particular quote comes from an article I was very fortunate. John Hattie and I collaborated recently on an article that looks at this idea of how to foster collective efficacy, and this idea that we need to interpret results by hearing from the students about their learning and evidence of student artifacts, but also listening to students' conversations and what can we observe from students that will help inform our interpretation of how we are doing if we're meeting those student learning needs. These are some of the questions that are in the article as well, stepping back and saying, what is the evidence that we have that what we did had an impact? Are we getting a year's growth for a year's input? And how will we know? And when I think about this idea of helping teams interpret results, this is a framework that came out of a conversation with a teacher leader who was working in an Indigenous inquiry, really trying to move her team forward. And she asked me, Jenni, how do we know when it's time to move on to the next question? And I don't think that's something that I could answer for her, but we could think about, did the results from your collaboration result in improvement in student outcomes or no improvement? And if there was an improvement, does the team have no understanding of how and why those results were achieved, or does your team have a clear understanding of how and why the results were achieved? And as this framework of helping teams interpret results, as a leader, how can you use this to ask these questions of teams? The third path is where there's no improvement in student outcomes and the team has no understanding, or no improvement, path 4, and clear understanding. So the question becomes, how do we get our teams on paths 2 and 4? And if the team has an improvement in student outcomes with no understanding, the question you can pose as a leader is, was it luck or did the change in practice make a difference, and how can we find out? How can we help the team find out? If it's path 2, where the results from our joint work showed an improvement in student outcomes and our team has a clear understanding of how those results were achieved, what gets teams on this path is the collaborative analysis of student work, where they're bringing a few student samples, students that they're curious about, to the table, where they're looking at progress over time. And then they start to drill down in our experience, where when they bring that student work, they start to realize that perhaps certain groups of students need additional scaffolding and supports, and they start to drill down and differentiate for students without us saying you need to differentiate. They start to do that naturally. Path 3, if there's no improvement and no understanding, what got in the way? And remember, it's important to separate person from practice. Sometimes we use, and I'll use Stephen Katz's language again around activity traps, those things that divert our time and energy away from what matters most, and that's the student learning need, sometimes get in the way. And if we're on path 4, we've not seen an improvement, but our team has a clear understanding of how and why, then that's really important too, to figure out, what did we learn and what do others need to know? And so just overarching, and the significance of the umbrella on this particular slide is this idea of the role of trust. And what I hear sometimes people say in the field is, we can't begin this work because we don't have trust established. But really, I think that there's a minimal amount of trust necessary to encourage teachers to come together and do some of this work and dig into this work. And Katz and his colleagues have found that trust is actually a result of collaboration as opposed to a precursor or an antecedent. And Megan Shannon Moran's research on trust shows the same thing. She talks about that people think this is, or one of the biggest surprises in her research on trust is that sometimes people assume that it's hard to develop, but in the absence of any warning signs or red flags, she says that people are more likely to extend provisional trust because it's an easier option. The watchfulness and wariness of distrust takes more energy. So let's not let that idea that we have to establish this huge culture of trust before we can dig into this work prevent us from moving ahead. Just very briefly too, this idea, we know people's efficacy beliefs come from these past experiences. One of my favorite books, it's kind of hot off the presses, The Power of Moments by Chip and Dan Heath. And it resonated with me because I'm starting to think about and look for, how can we bring these mastery experiences to light for educators? What are opportunities for vicarious experiences and these other sources? Recently, I was at high school in Boyne City, and they had this great alumni hall of fame around the cafeteria, and it showed students who had been taught there in the past 10, 15, 20 years where they were as students and where they are now. And I thought, what a great example, a way to share with the staff the power of their work, their collective work together. And so what are some opportunities where we can look at some of these past experiences and bring the power of moments to light? and that it goes along with this idea of celebrating small wins. And I love this quote from The Power of Habit because it speaks to me of building collective efficacy through that recognition of small wins, helping people realize their mastery moments, because that helps to fuel transformative changes by looking at those tiny advantages, but convincing people that those patterns can be within reach and that achievement can be reached. In addition to this, the last thing around, we talked about leadership practices. We looked at the role of trust, the sources of past experiences, but this idea of changing the narrative in schools and thinking about some of the language that we use and that we hear, and some shifts that we might start really focusing on, moving conversations from that of low expectations to high expectations, and from focusing on covering the curriculum to what is it that our students are learning, knowing, understanding, experiencing, attributing success to things that are within our realm of control rather than external things, and moving from that us versus them to the we mentality. In that article with Professor Hattie, what resonated with me, what he said is if the conversation is around timetables and schedules, then we have the power to shift that, to move the conversation to progress and impact. And how are we impacting student learning through our actions? So our timing, I think, is good. We've got a few minutes left for some questions. I'll just ask you to revisit the success criteria one last time and do a bit of self-assessment as I turn it over to Jeff to kind of monitor and help us through some of the questions that you might have asked in this last hour.
Hello, I have one question for you that's come in so far, and here it is. How can we build teachers' confidence when they are expressing teacher burnout? For example, we took on a new math and science curriculum that has overwhelmed our staff.
So I guess what I wonder, and I think what we know about fostering change that's impactful is that when we bite off more than we can chew, like I'll use an example from Ontario. We have been working toward implementing a 3-part lesson plan. So minds-on action consolidation. Perhaps it's, a similar example because teachers found it very overwhelming. If we think about just the minds-on, there's so many strategies to activate prior knowledge, just getting a grasp of what are some of those strategies that are effective, what's the purpose behind them. The minds-on section, which we're really trying to get people to use inquiry and problem-solving approaches in their instruction, that's a huge chunk to bite off, let alone that final chunk around consolidation. People are running out of time. They don't know necessarily some really effective ways to foster that consolidation in ways that teachers are helping students engage in metacognition. I mean, there's a lot there, like in your math curriculum on the 3-part lesson. And what we learned about implementing change in meaningful ways is if you bite off more than you can chew, you're definitely not going to meet with any success. So I think that identifying some areas of strength for the teachers of what their current knowledge and understanding in the new math curriculum, in the new math program, starting small and really deepening their professional knowledge, supporting them in the changes in the classroom, and helping to recognize when they have met with success. And really, I think engaging them in those opportunities to share what they're learning, celebrate the small wins, and just really take it one small step at a time. I think that helps.
Terrific. One last question. How do you move teams from data analysis to change instructional practices?
Yeah, that's a good question. I found that when we started with trailing data, looking at patterns from the past, I think it's got a place, and I think that's important. but we ask teachers to bring data that is related to the kids that are in front of them right now. It might be a writing sample, looking at students' ability to infer. And it's, changing the conversation from looking at data to looking at evidence, and accepting that evidence can be also conversations, observations, valuing that idea of taking a few student samples and trying to monitor their progress over time. I think that has changed the conversation by having teachers really take one student, try to figure out as a team, what is it, if it is the example of inferring, what are some effective instructional strategies that perhaps I don't use that maybe you use, or that we can dig into that we know from experts in the field, tapping on some external sources perhaps, doing some reading about it, doing some professional learning. And then I think the important part is, in some ways, holding each other accountable to bring that student evidence back a few weeks down the road. Did the strategies that we thought might work make a difference? And do we have another student sample that looks at that same skill of inferring that show that what we did either worked or didn't work, and if it didn't work, then why? But it's bringing student work to the table, I think, frequently, and that fine-grained evidence where we're not looking at, large-scale assessment data, but we're looking at the evidence of the students that are in front of us today.
Terrific. That brings us to the end of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think that just in some concluding comments, there's a lot of good stuff out there. A friend of mine, Thompson, just wrote an article that's posted this week on Corwin Connect, A Doorway to Collective Efficacy. I know my other friend, Peter DeWitt's been doing a lot of work. He's got some great books out there as well. But just directing you to Corwin's bookstore and the Corwin Connect if you just want to go on and check out some of the blogs. There's lots of great titles. And I know that I guess I just want to end with this quote, because when I found it, I thought it really speaks to the notion of collective efficacy and the importance of our beliefs becoming our thoughts. And I'll let you go ahead and read that quote in conclusion. I will turn it over to Charlene, who has just a couple of concluding comments. And I know that this went fairly quickly, but it will be archived for you as well, so you can always go back to it.
All right. Thank you so much, Jenni, for the wonderful presentation. I hope everybody learned a little bit about the research behind collective efficacy and some of the leadership practices that support collective efficacy. If you'd like more information about Jenni's work around collective efficacy and practical strategies for supporting efficacy in your school or district, you can check out Jenni's book, available through Corwin at www.corwin.com. And as a thank you for attending our webinar today, we are offering a special 20% off promo code that you see on the screen there, which you can use for your order. We'll be sharing this code as well as the recording for this webinar and the slides as a resource in the follow-up email afterward. Jenni's other work, especially on collaborative teacher inquiry, which is a very powerful method for providing those collaboration opportunities for teachers in schools, through Jenni's other best-selling Corwin titles. The book on the left, The Transformative Power of Collaborative Inquiry, is for school leaders and professional learning leaders who are interested in supporting teacher collaboration and collaborative inquiry in schools. On the right is Jenni's first booklet, Corwin, Collaborative Inquiry for Educators, and this is a facilitator's guide for both the participants in the collaborative teacher inquiry as well as those who are leading the collaborative inquiry teams and cycles. So these books are also available at Corwin.com. If you'd like to invite Jenni to work directly with your team and your teachers on site, she is a certified visible learning consultant who can deliver workshops, keynotes, and seminars on John Hattie's visible learning research and ways to develop assessment-capable learners. And Jenni is also an expert on collective teacher efficacy and can work directly with your leadership team to support the development of efficacy through high-quality professional learning. You can contact Corwin for more information at info@corwin.com. And that concludes our presentation for today. I would like to thank everybody on behalf of Corwin and on behalf of Jenni for joining us, and we hope you have a great day.